Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a pretty important figure in the Indian legal system, the Attorney General. Whether you're a UPSC aspirant or just curious about how India works, this one's for you.
Yeah, the Attorney General is a big deal. Think of them as like the government's top lawyer. They give advice on all sorts of legal stuff and even represent India in those big court cases.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Who is this Attorney General and how do they get the job?
Well, the Attorney General, or AG for short, is chosen by the President of India. And, to even be considered, you got to have some serious qualifications. Like, you could be a Supreme Court judge with this background. We're talking at least 5 years experience as a high court judge, or 10 years as an advocate in a high court, or, just be seen as like a super expert in law by the president himself.
Wow, so no slouches in this position. They need real legal firepower. But how long do they actually stay in the job? Is there like a set term?
Actually, the Constitution doesn't say exactly how long they serve. It's more like they serve as long as the president wants them to. So they can be removed by the president or they can decide to resign on their own.
So they are connected to the government in that way? But you said earlier they aren't a politician, right? How does that work?
Right. And that's key. They're all about the legal stuff, not the politics. So, getting into the nitty-gritty, what does the Attorney General actually do?
Well, the Constitution says their main job is advising the government on anything legal that the president sends their way.
And that's not all. They handle any other legal tasks the president throws at them and also take care of duties outlined in the Constitution or in other laws.
So basically, they're the government's go-to for legal stuff, arguing cases in the Supreme Court, representing India in special references.
Yep. Those times when the president asks the Supreme Court for their opinion on a legal issue.
Right. And even stepping into high courts if needed. That's a lot on their plate. But with all that power, do they have any special rights? Or are there things they can't do?
Oh, for sure. They have the right of audience in all Indian courts. That means they can argue cases anywhere in the country. They can also be part of those parliamentary proceedings and committees, the discussions and debates in Parliament. But here's the thing. They can't vote.
Whoa, hold on. A voice in Parliament but no vote? Why is that?
It's all about keeping things impartial. Remember, they're not supposed to be playing the political game.
Makes sense. But you mentioned limitations too, right? What are those?
They can't go against the government or advise against them, which makes sense, right? Their loyalty has to be with the government they're representing.
Right, no playing both sides. So it's all about avoiding conflicts of interest. But does that mean they can't do any other legal work outside of being Attorney General?
Now, this is where it gets interesting. Unlike some other big government positions, the Attorney General isn't like a full-time government employee. They can actually have their own private legal practice.
Hold on. So they advise the government and take on private clients. That sounds like it could be a lot to handle and maybe even lead to some tricky situations.
Definitely shows how unique this role is. And speaking of unique, did you know there's a whole team backing up the AG? There's the Solicitor General and the Additional Solicitor General. They help the Attorney General do all that work.
So it's a team effort.
Mm-hmm.
But how are those positions different from the Attorney General? It's all legal work, right?
The big difference is in how they come to be. The Constitution actually specifically mentions the Attorney General's position. The Solicitor General and Additional Solicitor General, though, aren't directly mentioned in the Constitution. It's more like they exist out of tradition and because it just makes things work better in practice.
Got it. So a legal hierarchy with the Attorney General at the top guiding the Solicitor General and Additional Solicitor General. Makes sense to have that structure.
Exactly. And this whole legal team is separate from the Law Minister, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Of course, the Law Minister is a politician, part of the cabinet, totally different from the Attorney General.
Right. And keeping them separate makes sure the Attorney General stays an impartial legal advisor. No politics involved. Their advice has to be all about the law, not any political agenda.
So they really are walking a tightrope, huh? Giving solid legal advice while also navigating the world of politics.
Definitely. They need to know the law, but also understand the political scene, a nuanced understanding.
That takes skill and a lot of integrity, too. What happens if the government wants something that the Attorney General doesn't think is legal? Do they have to, stand up to some pretty powerful people?
That's what makes this job so interesting. It's not just about being a lawyer for the government. They also have to protect the Constitution.
So they got to be ready to hold their ground, even if it makes people upset. And remember, we said they're appointed by the president, but their loyalty is to the Constitution, not to any specific government or party.
Exactly. Impartiality and being objective are so important. Their advice has to come from the law, not from what's politically convenient. But separating those two, legal opinion and political stuff, it can't be easy.
A real balancing act. But you're right, being impartial is crucial for a healthy democracy. The Attorney General acts as a check on the government's power, making sure they're playing by the rules.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, especially those UPSC folks who are really digging into this, let's recap. The Attorney General is the government's top legal advisor, appointed by the president.
Right. And they've got tons of responsibilities, from giving legal advice to representing the government in court, all while upholding the Constitution.
And don't forget those special rights, like being able to argue cases in any court in India. But of course, there are limitations to avoid those conflicts of interest.
Yep, no playing both sides. And one of the most interesting things is that tension between being a legal expert and that political pressure.
They have to be able to tell the government no, even if that's not what they want to hear.
Which is why understanding this role is so important. It shows us how the legal system works and how the government operates within that system. It's not just theory, it's real-world stuff.
It is. And if anyone's thinking, okay, this is interesting, but where can I learn more? Well, there are tons of resources out there. The Supreme Court of India website, for example, has a whole bunch of judgments and orders, lots of them involving the Attorney General.
Oh, so you can actually see the arguments and decisions being made in real cases.
Exactly. And of course, our UPSC aspirants will find all the details they need in those standard textbooks on Indian polity.
Those are essential for understanding the constitutional role of the Attorney General.
For sure. But going beyond the textbooks and looking at real cases, that's what really brings it to life. You see the impact the Attorney General has.
It's one thing to read about it in a book. It's another to see it play out in an actual courtroom.
It adds a whole new layer to understanding it. Now, for those UPSC aspirants who are comfortable with the basics, let's push a bit further. What are some of the more nuanced aspects of the Attorney General's role they should be thinking about?
Okay, so beyond the textbook stuff, where do things get really interesting? What are some of those things that aren't so obvious that a UPSC aspirant should be considering?
All right, here are a few things to think about. First, how the Attorney General's role is always changing.
Oh, interesting. So it's not a fixed, unchanging job?
Nope. It has to adapt as the legal and political landscape changes in India. The challenges and responsibilities change too.
So it's dynamic and responsive to the world around it. Makes sense.
Another thing to consider is the relationship between the Attorney General and the judiciary. How does their advice and the way they represent the government affect the decisions made by the courts? And how do those court rulings, in turn, influence how the Attorney General approaches legal issues?
It's a two-way street. The Attorney General is a part of the legal system, but also interacts with it and shapes it.
Precisely. And lastly, think about the bigger picture. What does the Attorney General's role mean for democracy and the rule of law in India? How do they help ensure the legal system is fair?
Okay, so we've got the changing nature of the role, the relationship with the judiciary, and the impact on democracy and the rule of law. A lot to think about.
It is, and this is just scratching the surface. There were so many fascinating questions surrounding the Attorney General.
Like opening a door to a whole universe of legal complexities.
There is. And this isn't just for legal scholars or UPSC aspirants. This is relevant to everyone.
You're right. It's easy to think about the legal system as something that's, far away, just happening in courtrooms. But it really does affect all of us.
Exactly. Our fundamental rights, how accountable the government is, the balance of power in our democracy, it's all connected.
And the Attorney General is right there in the thick of it.
They're not just dealing with legal theories. The Attorney General's decisions and the cases they argue, those have real-world consequences for everyone.
Absolutely. Sometimes those consequences are massive, like with those landmark Supreme Court cases that have shaped India.
Yeah, the Attorney General is often right in the middle of those, arguing for the government.
It's pretty amazing to think about. Their actions can actually influence the course of history.
It really is, and that's why it's so important for people to be informed about this role. We need to understand how the Attorney General works, the pressures they face, because those decisions can end up affecting our own lives.
It's not just about some abstract legal theories, right? It's about how those theories play out in the real world.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. What qualities and skills do you think are most important for an Attorney General to have?
Ooh, good question. Is it just about being a legal genius, or are there more to it than that?
I think it's a whole bunch of things. Of course, they need a deep understanding of the law, the Constitution.
Right, the fundamentals.
But they also need to be amazing communicators, being able to explain those complicated legal arguments that